Hello, I'm Michelle Desmond, and I am a thanatologist, which is an expert in death, dying, and bereavement. I came to this work after a long career in business. I went to business school and worked for major companies in marketing and innovation. I also had a lifetime filled with losses of people that I love. And these experiences motivated me to formally study thanatology. I think death and grief had just become a part of my life since I was 13 years old when my dad died. I experienced the loss of my husband to cancer, my best friend to cancer, and then when my mother died a couple years ago, the universe finally told me, this is actually your life's work. So I left my career and went back to school and got a master's degree. Once I found thanatology, I knew it was the exact right place for me. And I've become so passionate and excited about influencing the modern experience of death and grief because there's so little available to help people. We get so little education, and there's so much opportunity to make things a little more tolerable in a really scary and difficult space. So that's why I do what I do. I am teaching a class about technology, which this term was coined by Dr. Carla Sofka back in 1997. Is a professor at Siena College and works in the social work school. She wrote a study about the early days of the internet and how it was changing things in terms of death and grief. I came across this while studying thanatology myself. I As I said, I had gone back to school coming from this career working in, marketing and innovation. And early in my career, I worked in technology with high-speed internet. I was really drawn to this space of, yes, actually, technology changed so much and the internet changed so much about death and grief. I can talk more about that. Here we are, almost 30 years later after Dr. Sofka's study, and it's so pervasive in terms of our interactions with especially social media, but so many other ways that technology comes into play. There are effects, both positive and potentially not as positive, with this happening to us. And so I just became really interested in it. I made it the focus of my coursework. I did my final project podcast actually on thanatechnology, or, some people call it death tech, or, anything that has to do with death and grief online. And I became so excited about it that I signed up to go back to the school where I studied and teach master's students a course. It's the first course that I know of, at least in the US, where people are talking about this for an entire course. And we're having a great time. We're wrapping up the first semester of it. My students are energized. I'm really energized. And I see so much opportunity for us to help people more with technology. There's a before and after of how people were accustomed to interacting with death planning and what happened when someone was sick and dying. It used to be very analog and there wasn't a lot of information. People were just reacting in the moment. Some were proactive about writing a will or signaling their wishes, but things have become much more, I think, good in terms of we have access now to doing a lot of these activities online, and you can research a lot more, and you can, see other people's stories and be influenced by other people of how they've thought about their end of life planning, or in fact, right, watching their journeys. We're all exposed through social media, people sharing stories about being ill and their end of life. It's all very in our face and something that we get to think about a little bit more than we used to. The challenge in this is we're now carrying with us so many digital assets. Sometimes they're called digital remains, but there's this vast amount of data and accounts online that there isn't a lot of planning done. And this is kind of the big gap where things have changed, but the planning hasn't changed with us. At best, most people are maybe assigning a legacy contact to their Google account or their Facebook account if they have one. But there's so much more, right? If we think about how much we've created all this content, we have accounts, we've got our Venmo, so much that's digital. And the law and end of life planning haven't necessarily caught up to that. It's both great in terms of it's easier to do your end of life planning now, and there's more tools. There's a big piece of it that we don't really know what to do with. And we don't know what are people's rights after they're gone. What becomes of our digital legacy when there aren't a lot of rules or laws? One of the things we've been exploring in my class, for instance, is it's pretty routine where somebody has died and other people take to social media, share pictures, tell stories, and continue that legacy building. And we very rarely stop to think, would that person want these things posted? Right? Would this one person raised the scenario of a child. So if a young child has died and their family continues to post pictures of them years later, if that child was now an adult, would they want this done? Right? I just think there's so much in end of life planning that's, tech influenced or tech involved that needs to be addressed and solved. And I think that's a huge opportunity in this space. So one of our modules was on final disposition and funerals. And I think the more obvious connections for technology as relates to someone's death and what happens to them afterwards are, there's a lot of innovation on where you can get a casket if you choose to be buried, right? We talk a lot about the way people are doing funerals in new and different ways, especially what we had to do during COVID. But yeah, these alternative solutions, which might include, for instance, human composting, there actually is a tech-enabled element of that is not very well understood. I had the opportunity to visit one of the human composting facilities here in Seattle. It's called Recompose. And what they're doing is very thoughtfully and respectfully caring for bodies in a natural way where they compost down to a significant amount of soil, but that soil can be repurposed in a designated forest area or given to the family, right? So, you think on the face of that, okay, that's very natural. But if you look at how they do it, it's very precise in measurements of temperatures that need to be sustained or achieved, how they handle the person as they go through this process. And so there's a lot going on to enable this process through technology. And I think as this movement grows where people are interested in composting, a more natural burial, or aquamation, which is like a hydrolyzation solution, a lot of this is going to rely on technology to scale it and make sure it's going according to the way it should. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting space and a huge appeal to a lot of people who would prefer not to take up space in a cemetery or experience the cremation process. It's very important if people can face making these decisions ahead of time, which is difficult, right? These aren't the things that most people like to think about, but giving them some thought. And you talked earlier about our legacy, how we would choose to be returned back to where we came from physically is a part of that. Having the fortitude to learn about these options and signal your choices ahead of time also relieves a burden from your family and loved ones. After someone has died is a really emotional time, and asking people to make those decisions for you just kind of adds to the pain they're already in. And so what if we all could just say, I would like to be composted, or I would like to experience aquamation. There's a part of it that we could create intention around, but it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to think about it. I worry sometimes that the notion of death positivity starts to lead to discussions of toxic positivity, right? Like where it's like, this is some trendy term or overused or not realistic. But I like the thought of death neutrality or just recognizing death. It's fascinating the way our society has shifted to a space where it's this topic that we find so incredibly difficult, and it's so hidden and almost, in some cases stigmatized to confront it and to think about it. And it didn't used to be that way, right? We've made a lot of positive changes in the way we live, but we've shoved death out of the way and assumed that it's going to happen to somebody else. Unfortunately, the reality is it happens to all of us. We'd all be better suited at being able to talk about it and lay out our plans in a way that helps other people too. I often think back to my own mother's experience. My dad died when I was 13, and I was the only child. My mom shared a lot with me. And I recall her heading to the funeral home and being really worried about how it was going to go, how much she was going to get pressured. And she didn't have the money to spend on this coffin and funeral. She was really stressed out about it. She came home almost proud that she'd been able to resist the pressure. They had tried to sell her on the highest end coffin. She said, I held firm and got the pine box or whatever the entry level box was. And she said, Daddy wouldn't care. Daddy wouldn't care what box he was in. Now, had my father told her that? Probably not. He died suddenly. It was very out of the blue. But she knew just going into it to kind of gear herself up. Not everybody knows that. Not every funeral home is going to pressure people in that way, right? There's some incredibly kind and caring funeral home directors, but there are enough experiences of the hard upsell and emotional push that people expect it and anticipate it, or they get blindsided. Either way, it's not really positive. Either you're like my mom, devastated by this shocking loss and kind of walking in all, tense, or you walk in oblivious and walk out having spent, $10,000 on something that your loved one would have wanted. Yeah. So you're right. The funeral home industry, it's embedded, it's big. A lot of, kind of business models, they're not necessarily easy to change based on how the work is done. So yeah, it's an interesting space. And I think there is some disruption coming. So I think you and I are both familiar with Titan Casket. Titan Casket offers caskets online and really innovative approach to doing that. But most people don't know that you don't have to buy your casket from the funeral home. You could order from Titan Casket and have it shipped to the funeral home and they have to use it, right? But when you're in the thick of things and you roll up into the funeral home, they're not necessarily going to say, you don't have to buy your in here, right? That's not in their best interest, but you could save yourself a lot of money if you ordered it through Titan. So yes, I think this is a space where the more people who are accustomed to having options and to doing all these things online, the more the digital native people start to be faced with arranging funerals and buying products. There's going to be less tolerance for the old ways. I think it'll probably be an interesting upheaval. It's an industry that runs the gamut in terms of, yes, the more like established, old school, the newer, progressive. I think there's also one of the things I really appreciated learning in my thanatology studies is it is becoming a lot more diverse. There's a really important and compelling history, particularly of experiences for Black people in burial. There was this separate community who knew practices appropriate to that community, and other funeral homes didn't even know the basics of traditions and caring for bodies. And so I've been really pleased to see that there's a lot of expansion of understanding, and even funeral homes thinking about how will I care for people of different races or cultures. That's such an important shift that has been happening that I think is so encouraging. Cultural differences and individual family belief practices are so important, right? Kind of coming back to our technology discussion, there can be so many more options presented or knowledge of what people might want or need that could then be built upon if you're using predictive enabling technology to say, oh, am I going to remember to ask them about this and this? Or maybe I should offer them this, or this choice, or make sure I have people that have expertise in what they need. And how do I bring that in so that people are seen and their needs are met? I think there's going to be a tremendous opportunity here. Until fairly recently, when people weren't necessarily thinking about it, it was very siloed into big buckets of people, right? Whereas we can do so much better, I think, just with honoring preferences, practices, beliefs. Thanatology is a young field. It came into being in the latter half of the last century, so that's not that long of a time. A lot of the research that was done and available up until recently had a heavy degree of bias, right, towards a pretty specific profile of person. And I would say often like people who were easy to reach by researchers, people who were willing to participate and felt at ease in a research environment, which not everybody does, and the people that were at a stage in life, whether it be age or whatnot. So there's a lot of good research and an incredible body of work done. But when you go back and look at that research, it feels like it's missing a lot. And to your point about people actually practicing thanatology, meaning helping the dying, and the bereaved, they have a little more access to real information. And I do think the research is starting to catch up, but in general, the field was kind of based on what was available and who the researchers either had access to or chose to have access to. It's cool because it's such a growing field and so much opportunity to learn and support people. One thing we didn't really delve into when we talked about the future of technology and what it can do is the elephant in the room, which is things enabled by AI. I think this is a really interesting space on a lot of levels, whether it be what's available today with the grief bot, where you can have this amalgamation of a person. Either you choose to have it created or people create one after you're dead, and you can chat with this bot, all the way to potentially reanimating people. I think the ultimate thing that people talk about is porting our consciousness out of ourselves and into the cloud or wherever. But I think that's really both fascinating and a little bit concerning in terms of what's right for people, whether it be people who have legacies and what rights do they have and who needs permission to do what. And for grieving people, there's a ton of work on grief theory, right? All different types of the theory on how people grieve and what helps people cope and integrate their loss. Having a bot of your loved one around for 25 years is going to be helpful, hindrance, something that you don't relate to over time. There's just so many questions, and really smart people innovating and coming up with ideas in this part of the thanatological world, and lots of interesting questions. So that's just the other thing that I think will be fascinating to observe and influence and see what happens. The accessibility and the sustainability of it, both from how sustainable is it to exert the energy to maintain these things, but also how sustainable is it if that business goes out of business and now everything's gone, right? So many ethical questions, business questions, emotional questions. It's a really interesting space.